Welcome back to the shed. Tonight we're going to go back to 1981 and take a look at one of the Nebula Award finalists that year in A.A. Attanasio's Radix. So what a fascinating novel this one was. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll make some recommendations and then I'll give this one a ranking. Firstly, I'd like to thank the viewer who recommended this one to me. I sort of was familiar with the novel, having read a lot of the Nebula and Hugo Award finalists, but I didn't have it on my TBR, and I definitely didn't have it in my collection. So I went out there, hunted it down, and geez, I'm glad that I did. And what makes this one rather interesting and fascinating, hopefully will come through when I talk to what I liked and I didn't like in this one. So when it comes to the plot, this is a rather interesting one because it follows this guy called Sumner Kagan. And Sumner is an interesting character because he's not your typical sort of protagonist, right? He's this very overweight kid. He's living alone with his mother, at home with his mother, and he's got all sorts of issues, and we're introduced to him in his sugar rat phase. This is an alter ego that he took on, and what he was doing during this phase, he was just going out there and basically being a gangster in many ways, a vigilante rather, because he's killing all these gangsters and people that have done him wrong. All unbeknownst to his mother, he's been doing all this sort of dodgy stuff that's put him on the radar for the forces in this far distant future Earth. So what we learn through a series of flashbacks is that Sumner Kagan is a white card. And what these white cards are is people that are genetically pure. Because in this far future Earth that Attanasio put together here, we have all sorts of mutations and distorts, I think, that we refer to in the novel, and alien beings. And it's a rather interesting concept, fascinating concept as to why this is, why we're having all these mutations happening. And I won't spoil it because I think that is one of the highlights in this novel, and which I thought was a very unique. I don't think I've ever seen it before in any kind of work of fiction before. So anyway, Sumner is this white card, and he's been abducted and assaulted, really, by these aliens called the Vor. And they're interested in his white card status, and these aliens are rather interesting creatures again, very fascinating alien species. I can truly say they were very alien in the way they behaved and just everything that they did. Very interesting alien species. But anyway, they've assaulted this guy because they want to sire an offspring of some sort, right? And their motives are not quite understood. So the law finally catches up with Kagan, and he goes through a whole series of adventures, and we'll talk about that in my likes and dislikes in a little bit. But he goes through a whole lot of adventures through these clan, through some kind of village. I can't remember exactly the name, and I'll come back to that as to why sometimes it's difficult to remember exactly what's going on in this novel. But he goes through this tribe of these distorts, and he befriends a whole lot of them, and it's really a journey of discovery that this Sumner goes through, and he's finally apprehended by the forces, these special forces, and he goes to some kind of concentration camp, and it pretty much looks like it's going to be the end of him. But one of the commanders in this meat camp, I think they were calling it, which was pretty much the bottom of the line, right, the end of the line for this guy, they sort of take interest in this guy being a white card, and he goes through this tremendous physical transformation. So he was always a really tall man, but he ends up being extremely fit and buff and strong looking guy, typical of what you would think one of these heroes protagonists would look like. So Sumner eventually meets up with his half alien son, and a whole lot of very interesting things happen there again, because there's this talk of this god mind, and at first, we're not quite sure what's going on with this god mind and what it is and what it isn't. But we know there seems to be a whole lot of different facets to this god mind as well. And we're sort of left hanging as to where does Sumner's part play in this story as well. And all is revealed through some flashbacks and very interesting ways that this exposition is done again. But we learn through some series of flashbacks as to what this group mind is, and slowly but surely things start to piece back together, and we get back on track into what is a very fascinating ending and very fascinating novel indeed. So what is it that I liked in this one? Look, I'd have to say the thing that makes this one stand apart, it's its uniqueness, right? I honestly don't think I've seen a novel which is how many pages actually? 464 pages, which includes some of the profiles of the different users and an epilogue, and there's a bit of a timeline there as well. So it's a rather chunky novel. But I've got to say, I don't think I've ever seen a book with this much ambition. I mean, it just covers so much, and there's just so many interesting concepts that are truly unique in the science fiction world. And it's a rather bizarre that this novel doesn't get the accolades that it does. I've got some thoughts as to why that may be, and I may talk to that in some of my dislike sections. But the thing that really stood out for me is just the magnitude of concepts in this one, and all very unique as well. I just don't think I've read a piece of work like this as unique as what Radix is. The other thing that I enjoyed with this one is that these concepts are so unique that it really does force you to slow down in your reading, which I've mentioned in the past. Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun sort of comes to mind immediately. Very sort of similar book where you have to slow your reading down because you're going to miss it. This is not one you want to gloss over. This is one that you want to read slowly. You really want to comprehend what's going on here to get the full enjoyment. And I sort of like that. I really like that when sometimes, especially when I'm shooting videos that I want to get out weekly, I do sometimes fall into that trap of just speed reading, right? And typically that's not a problem to date when I've read most of the books that we've covered to date on the Sci-Fi shed ladder just in front of me here. It's because that's really a refresher for me. I'm familiar with these novels. I just want to rank them and share my passion for them with you. But I'd have to say that with this one, you know, you have to slow down, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the fact that I had to slow down and just get lost in the wonderful imagination that Attanasio has here, and just in the wonderful world building and these really interesting concepts. So I enjoyed that as well. The other thing that I enjoyed is that, again, it is that uniqueness, and I've mentioned in the past several times on this channel that, you know, these books that sometimes blend science fiction and fantasy, adventure fantasy, I would say in this one, are rather interesting, right? They've sort of fall in that little niche, and I could definitely see the fantasy elements in this one, and I really enjoyed the science fiction themes in this one. Some very interesting and, you know, unique concepts as to why these, you know, distorts or these mutations were taking place, and I don't want to talk to that because I really thought it was unique and a highlight that you ought to read to experience for yourself. So that's a lot of accolades. So what is there that I didn't like in Attanasio's Radix? Look, I'd have to say that this is one of those very polarizing novels. I think this is one of those novels that you either love or you hate. It's got partly to do with the fact that the pacing sometimes feels a bit off. I mean, it sort of starts well and it goes through peaks and troughs. And about two-thirds of the way through the book, there was a section there that really did slow down and really almost had me disengage. Only to, you know, by the next couple of paragraphs or the next chapter, had me fully engaged at the edge of my seat reading it. So I just found that it was so ambitious at times, and I thought the pacing was not always quite on par. And I think that you will be well rewarded if you get through those slow sections. If you're anything like me, you just work your way through the slow sections, because there are just gems, I think, in this novel. The other thing that may put some people off, and I was sort of, again, it all comes together. That's the thing about this novel, is that sometimes it gets all rather confusing, right? There's a lot that's going on, and it's sometimes not quite coherent, and it makes not a whole lot of sense, but it all does come back together, right? It goes through those cycles where you're sort of saying, well, what's it talking about? What's going on here? I don't get the interactions between these people. I'm not quite getting the threads that make this tapestry, right, to use that analogy. But it does all come together in the end, and I think it does come together really well. But again, I just found that sometimes it seems to be a bit confusing, a little bit hard to follow. But I would say, again, similar to the point I made about the pacing, you just stick to it, because I think you will be rewarded. The other thing that I would mention in this novel, and it wasn't a put off for me, but I can see some people being a bit annoyed by it, there's a lot of mysticism in here, right? It gets into a bit of new age type stuff, and I wouldn't say it's over the top. I don't think it is that, but it just goes into some of these mystical sort of realms that may put some people off. And he also has some made up words that are not in the English dictionary, but they're not too difficult to follow or understand. It's not like it's completely made up in some of the, for example, in the Book of the New Sun in Gene Wolfe's again, right? So he makes up some words that I think will turn some people off. That wasn't my experience with that. I didn't really mind those made up words, and I think it helped me personally understand the world that this was built on, and get into Attanasio's mind when it comes to these concepts. So again, very enjoyable for me. So when it comes to recommendations, and I've mentioned it a few times already, I think if you enjoyed books like Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, there's a lot of similarities there, because this was also set in a far distant future, post-apocalyptic world. There was talk of, fantasy themes and science fiction themes blended all together. Took you on a real big hero's journey and adventure. And that is, again, very similar to what we find in Radix. So I think if you like Gene Wolfe's book, I think you will like this one as well. I did mention that the novel can be a bit sporadic and a little bit disjointed at times. So the other obvious recommendation that comes to mind immediately is Samuel R. Delaney's The Einstein Intersection, because in some ways it's not as disjointed, Radix that is. It's not as disjointed as what we find in The Einstein Intersection, but there's also those kind of, mysticism and myth thrown in here that I think if you like The Einstein Intersection, but you thought this was maybe a little bit too much and you want to tame it down a bit, I think you will enjoy Radix as well. Behind me here is a whole bunch of Philip K. Dick novels. Pick any one of those. If you've enjoyed any one of those, I think you will enjoy Radix as well. So look, thank you for recommending this one. I was fascinated. I thought it was intriguing. I thought it was very ambitious, and it took me places that I've never been taken before in science fiction. So look, I highly recommend this one. I gave it a 4. It's more like a 3 and an 8, but I gave it a 4 out of 5 in Goodreads, because there were some sections there that sort of had me a little disengaged. But overall, I think this is a fascinating novel, and it really should be talked about a whole lot more, with the caveat that I think this one is a bit polarizing. Hey, have you read it? What are your thoughts of it? Do you think it's underrated? Do you think it's just justified that it wasn't that much of a great novel and I'm making too much of it? I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions as always. And I thank you for spending some time with me in the shed. And I'll see you next time in the shed. And what have I got coming up? Oh, am I reading a classic at the moment? I hope you join me next week for that.